Hello, today we're going to be talking about the rise of industrial agriculture. Before we get into industrial agriculture, I'll remind you that with the advent of the agricultural revolution, for about 10,000 years, humans practice some form of extensive agriculture. In its pure forms, you have Swidden, which is crop rotation plus fallow, which varied around the world depending on soil conditions, environment. So in tropical rainforests, you had long periods of fallow where the forest just grew back. In more temperate areas with good soils where you had glaciers, you would have a crop rotation and maybe a period of a year where grasses were allowed to grow and animals would forage on that. And then pastoralism is the act of living off animals, usually raising mixed herds of animals, but in some cases, either because of climate, such as in Northern Europe, people focused on a single animal, reindeer, in the case of Northern Europe, or for a while, people emphasized single animals for convenience. Horses, I think I mentioned in the previous lecture that people who practiced horse pastoralism often required new space because horses are pretty tough on pasture. And one of the negative things about extensive agriculture is that for a community to grow and thrive, you often have to go to war to annex more land. This mentality, actually, that control over land is a motivation for warfare and violence, actually persevered into the 20th century. If you think about the Nazis, they had this term Lebensraum, which meant living space. And a major reason for the invasion of Eastern Europe, the former Soviet Union, was that the Nazis had dreams of annexing Ukraine and colonizing it with German farmers. So this idea that communities can grow and thrive only at the expense of others by acquiring more land, something that's around from early agricultural period, and it persisted into the current day, or at least until very recent times. I'm sure there are still examples in the world where people think this way. Intensive agriculture is the act of producing more food on a unit of land. When we talked about Thomas Malthus, this is what Malthus didn't foresee, that he thought food production was locked, that it was kind of a constant variable. He didn't foresee the ability of innovation to be able to increase food production on a given unit of land. And there are two ways that we can do that. Today, we're going to focus on capital intensive agriculture, or as it's often called, industrial agriculture. And what I'll argue, at least in a future lecture, is that perhaps capital intensive agriculture is the better word. Industrial agriculture, I would argue, is how to best call what we have up until about now, but what we're seeing is new capital intensive technology emerging that will eliminate a lot of the negative aspects of what we've been calling industrial agriculture. Labor intensive agriculture we'll talk about in a future lecture too, and as the word implies, it's producing more food on a unit of land by adding more labor, but it's more complicated than that. It's about being innovative too, finding ways to mimic natural ecosystems to capture more of the sun's energy that's falling on the land, doing that without a lot of capital, but doing that through human labor, but also the application of innovation to human labor to create ecosystems that are food producing machines, but look a lot more like natural systems. But we'll save that discussion for future lecture. So the focus on this lecture is on capital intensive agriculture. And before we get going, I need to point out some of the benefits, and you got to get these benefits. You have to allow them to sink in, because people find so many flaws, and there are so many flaws in industrial agriculture, that it's easy to lose sight of the benefits And if you don't understand the benefits, you can propose solutions that can be harmful in other ways that could harm sustainability. So let's look at the benefits. First of all, it has allowed for the growth of large cities. And cities have the potential to allow us to live a lot more sustainably. Um, they also, not only from a environmental perspective, it makes sense to not scatter people in low density kind of suburban settlements. It makes more sense to have cities, but bringing people together in cities also unleashes innovation, economic development. Today, in today's world, cities are the economic engines that make countries go. Without industrial agriculture, it would be very hard to have large cities. Um, Abundant, cheap food enables large numbers of people to live in cities. Cheap food also enables the economies to grow by enabling the growth of other sides of the economy, like industry and services. Um, as people have more money to spend on other things, this this allows humans to do more than just work to buy food. As the price of food goes down, frees up purchasing power so people can invest in education, can build businesses. This stimulates the economy, allows nations to collect more tax revenue that can be used for things like social security, investing in infrastructure, in universal education. Um, so there are lots of really important things industrial agriculture has done, and I'm just skimming the surface. So we can't lose sight of the benefits, and just be negative about industrial agriculture. When we think about its problems, we want to fix those problems without undoing a lot of its benefits. And what I'm alluding to is that often when people talk about the negative side of industrial agriculture, they propose solutions that would increase the amount of money people spend on food. And if you are a upper middle class person living in a income country, spending a bit more on food is not really a sacrifice. If you're living in a low income country, and Kenya by no means, which is represented in this graph, is the hardest hit country, there are other countries in the world where people spend a larger percentage of their income on food. If you look at Kenya's neighbors, you'll see a much higher percentage. Now, if you're talking about taking the amount of percentage that people spend on food from 45% to 55 or 60% through your solution, that's not very sustainable. You're doing a lot of damage to people in this category. So that's something to keep in mind, that not everybody is fortunate enough to spend 12% or less of their income on food, or even 15% or less. A lot of the people in the world are spending a third of their income or more on food. Here you can see this is from the United States from 1960 to 2013. You can see how for the average American, as a total food, 1916 was about 18% of the household budget, and that falls to about 10% by 2015. But you can see not everybody's in the same boat. The US is characterized by incredible inequality. So people who are in the lowest quintile, as you can see, are spending almost as much as people living in low income countries, same percentage of their income on food. So again, if you propose solutions to how we produce food that ignore the fact that we have lots of people, and even in our country, that are spending a third of their income on food, this is not a very sustainable approach. So any sustainable approach has to keep in mind that how it affects people on the lower end of the income spectrum. Right now, I want to give you a little bit of information about why and how industrial agriculture came about. So we had the agricultural revolution for more than 10,000 years, and it's really not until the last 150, 200 years that industrial agriculture, actually a little bit longer than that, there are kind of the seeds being planted back in the 18th century, but it's really begins to take off in the 19th century and then really explodes in the 20th century. So one of the main things that enabled industrial or capital intensive agriculture was the scientific revolution. A few of the things that occurred through the scientific revolution, all the way back in the 18th century, we have the emergence of selective breeding as applied to animals. It took plants a lot longer to catch up from this perspective. We also have heavy government investments in agricultural technology that play an important role. Around the middle of the 19th century, it was becoming clear that needed to do something to help growing number of people living in cities who had come there for industrial jobs. So industry used to be concentrated right in the core of cities, and people would live right next to where they worked. And in the early part of the Industrial Revolution, people were paid very poorly, and access to food was a major challenge. Governments in Europe and the United States invested a lot of money to find ways to feed those people more in a less costly manner. In the United States, if you think to the 1860s, when Abraham Lincoln was president, he created the land-grant college system to drive agricultural technology forward as a way to produce more food and do it cheaper. It was a major reason why we have universities like NC State, Virginia Tech, Clemson University. These were land-grant colleges that were created to drive agricultural technology to enable rural areas to increase food production, and so cities could be able to sustain themselves. All right, I mentioned that we have the beginnings of scientific revolution being applied to agriculture all the way back in the 18th century. In the 18th century, people figured out how to use selective breeding to create animals that could grow faster on the same amount of food, produce more milk. And they did this by simply, and this sounds to us today as rather obvious, but in the past, people had allowed animals to breed mostly willy-nilly. Animals would be out in the field, and you'd have a bull, or you'd have a few males out in the field, probably usually one male, and that male would breed with all the females. Well, people figured out that it was better to control breeding, so you would pick out instead your male with the most desirable characteristics, and you would breed that. So if it was beef, you would pick out the male that was the biggest, that had grown fastest, and you would pair that with cows that exhibited similar characteristics, rapid growth, large size, and those would be the ones that you would allow to breed, and you would restrict the breeding of other animals. And you can see the results with just two animals in Great Britain. If you look at sheep at the beginning of the 18th century, they're about the size of a mid-sized dog. They almost triple in size by the end of the century. They go from 28 to 80 pounds. For cattle, you have slightly more than a doubling. And this is all done through selective breeding. And the important thing to note is that 28-pound sheep and an 80-pound sheep, you are comparing apples to apples. This is sheep at a given point in their life. It's not that you're allowing them to grow, to live longer and get bigger. Within a certain time frame, they're reaching these weights, and they're doing so on the same amount of forage. So that's a big way that you can feed more people on less land. It took a lot longer to develop selective breeding techniques for key plants. And by key plants, I should say for our grains. That's where we get most of our energy, are from our um, either things in the grass family or some starchy tubers like potatoes. Uh, Starchy tubers like potatoes are easier to do selective breeding with because they are pollinated by insects, so people can move pollen artificially from one flower to the other. Grains are a much harder trick because they're wind pollinated. It's really hard to control where the source of pollen is. So that's one of the things that delayed um, the advancement of selective breeding in key crops or grasses. It also took a while for genetic knowledge. So Mendel is doing his experiments in the kind of middle of the 19th century. That knowledge takes a while to diffuse, and Mendel's experiments begin to flow into agronomy. Now, by the early 20th century, there are many people working on creating high yield varieties of grains. Corn becomes quickly the poster child, and it still is the poster child for what selective breeding can do on grain production. Now, while there are many people who deserve credit, the most important figure is Henry Wallace, who already by 1923 is producing high-yielding corn hybrid seed for sale. And what's interesting is, again, this shows kind of a delay between, but this time it's short. You've got this innovation that can really boost food production. 8 years later, so Wallace starts selling his seeds in Iowa in 1923. In 1931, only 1% of corn acreage in Iowa was planted with high-yield varieties. But by 1942, the figure had risen to 100%. Usually agricultural change is a lot slower, but what made it speed up was World War II. By 1939, it was obvious that American agriculture was going to have to step up to feed troops operating in different parts of the world. So government recognized that there was this technology that would allow farmers to produce a lot more food. So when the war started, they really began to push the use of high yield varieties. I won't get into this, but if you're a bio major, one of the main reason why corn is the poster child for selective breeding in crops is because it hybridizes so well and shows amazing results. There are also other aspects about corn from its rooting structure, the way it's oriented that allows lots of plants to be packed into a small space. Corn has many wonderful attributes that have allowed farmers to experiment and to find ways to create more and more yield out of a given unit of land. The one bad thing about hybridization is that hybrid vigor tends to break down. And what this has done is it's changed the way farmers look at planting their fields. And historically, farmers would save part of their seed to plant in the following year. The problem with hybrids like corn is that you get breakdown in vigor. So after a few years, basically yields go back to kind of very basic state, an unimproved yield. And this has been a boon for seed companies. It means that farmers have to come back year after year to buy seeds from the seed company rather than setting seeds aside to plant in the following year. So this is also an important step that's responsible for the rise of large agribusiness. So just graph that shows the incredible rise in corn yield in the US. You can see that from Civil War really until 1930, there's not much going on. Yields are around in the 30 bushel an acre. With World War II and the push government is putting on farms to adopt high yield varieties, you see yield starts to go up, and there have been years where we've gotten an average of above 160 um, bushels of corn per acre. That's almost an eightfold increase from where it was prior to people planting high yield seeds. Corn, because it hybridizes so well, and it really is much easier to work with than other grains. I mentioned is the poster child. You can see that wheat kind of has not responded as well as corn. We've more than doubled yields for wheat, but that's nothing compared to the eightfold increase in yields that we've seen for corn. And this is not just a US trend, it's a global trend. The US is higher on this chart in part because we have really good agricultural technology, but also we have some of the best soils in the world for growing corn. So that's part of the reason why the US is on top, but as you can see, all other parts of the world are trending upward and showing huge increases in corn yield. In the United States, this has had some consequences. Corn has been pushing wheat out. In areas where wheat was traditionally grown, farmers have been switching from wheat to corn, and this has some consequences. One of those consequences is environmental. As you push corn further and further west into the Great Plains, this is a really arid area, and corn requires a lot more water than wheat. So part of the rush to grow corn in really dry places is putting great stress on fossil aquifers like the Ogallala aquifer. People have to pull up water from the ground in order to water their corn. Talk about some other unintended consequences, but just want to point out the amazing yields that you can get out of corn. This is a famous farmer in Georgia, Randy Dowdy, who has gotten several years, has produced yields over 500 bushels an acre in Georgia. His results have made people believe that through selective breeding of corn, you could probably eventually push yields as far as 600 acres per bushel. But the key there is there's a limit. You can't ride this technology forever and expect yields to continue to go up and up. We're probably close to the max right now, and that's true for a lot of other key crops. We're close to the maximum production that we're going to get using the technology of selective breeding. So some of the unintended consequences of the triumph of corn, we've mentioned environmental impacts, political support. Big commodity farmers are very powerful, have a big pull over not just over the farm bill and subsidies going to agriculture, but even in the previous decade, powerful farmers, as it became clear we needed to look at renewable energy, pushed for major government subsidies to go into ethanol. And from 2000 to 2010, basically in that time frame, ethanol ate up a lot of the government funding going into renewable energy. And that was a bad thing because corn-based ethanol is a loser. It requires almost as much energy to produce a gallon of corn-based ethanol as you yield out of it. So the ratio is almost like 1 unit of energy and produces like 1.1 unit of energy. And that's a terrible ratio. The only reason we invested so much money in corn-based ethanol was because there was a very powerful lobby there. And that money would have been much better invested in other renewable technologies or energy storage. Another unintended consequence is that this has had a huge impact on how Americans eat and correspondingly has a very negative impact on our health. Our supermarkets are awash in high fructose corn syrup. Sugary drinks are super cheap, and that has really led to our obesity crisis, epidemic of type 2 diabetes. And the United States, after World War II, once had some of the highest life expectancy in the world. Today, we're ranked around number 50. And a lot of it has to do with our diets. And our poor diets are part a result of the triumph of corn. It's not just the sugary drinks that we're eating, it's also the fact that subsidized corn makes meat incredibly cheap. So basically, if you think, and we'll look at the farm bills later on that put lots of subsidy money into growing corn and making it even cheaper, that has helped make meals like a Happy Meal at McDonald's incredibly cheap and has pushed people away from healthier options that are not subsidized. Okay, I want to talk beyond, go beyond selective breeding. So selective breeding is really key to early industrial technologies, or at least to where we are now. And I believe now we're moving into a new phase where when I talk about industrial agriculture, the point from early on to where we got now, to me, that's kind of like first generation, the beginnings of really crude technologies compared to where we're going. But I want to go a little deeper into selective breeding, not from the science part, but selective breeding on its own wouldn't produce these high yields if it wasn't for a package of inputs. So selective breeding on its own would produce limited results if it's not for a package of other things that was developed to go along with selective breeding. So first of all, we have the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution is producing things like transportation advantages. If you think about shipping food around before on a sail ship, it would take such a long time that most things would perish. But in the 19th century, with the advent of steam engines for shipping and then railroads, you can now move things around really fast. Refrigeration allows you to even move things like bananas around and avoid a lot of spoilage. And actually, some of the first integration of this technology of transportation and refrigeration does come from the banana industry. And canning also, what these innovations do is it leads to an explosion in global food trade. And it means now that areas of the world can specialize in what they have a comparative advantage in. And this changes agriculture. It changes agriculture in that in the past, farmers grew a wide variety of crops and often raised many animals. They now begin to specialize. So if you were to go back to Iowa in the 1920s, you would probably find that a farmer was juggling 20 to 30 crops and animals. If you go to a farm in Iowa today, they probably just have corn, soybeans, and maybe hogs. Uh, so you've really narrowed specialization down, and that has produced huge monocultures, including entire regions that are basically giant monocultures. About 30 years ago, when I was a student, I drove across the U.S., went through the Corn Belt, and from the time I hit Kentucky until I got to the middle of South Dakota, it felt like I was in a giant cornfield the entire time. That is reflection of the change that comes in with industrial agriculture. Also, ghost acreage. I want to mention that it's the idea that if you're a wealthy country, you don't need to grow all the food you need. You can import food from abroad And I want to mention ghost acreage for two things. Often when we talk about population, um, we tend to have kind of weird standards. So when I was taking classes, back in the 1990s, we were often asked the question, do you think of the Benelux countries, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, as being overpopulated? And the answer of the class was usually no. And the question would be, do you think Bangladesh has a population problem? And students would often answer yes. And then we would be shocked to learn that the population density, at least back in 1990, was about the same. The main difference was that the Benelux countries were rich and could afford to import large amounts of food from other parts of the world. Bangladesh doesn't have those resources. In the modern world today, ghost acreage has taken a new turn. In the past, countries would just import food. Today, some Asian countries like Korea and China are actually acquiring land in other parts of the world to grow food to import back into their respective countries. This is taking ghost acreage to a new level. And some of the most popular places to buy land are Africa and in parts of the former Soviet Union, like Ukraine, that has incredible soils. Now, all of these technological advances have served to make food cheaper, expand the varieties of food that are available to us. Imagine having tropical fruits like avocado in the past, and have kept foods fresh a lot longer so they can be moved long distances. There's been various studies that often take Chicago as a starting point and look at how far food items have traveled to get to someone's dinner plate. And it's pretty shocking the distance that food travels to get to our plates today. Here you can see, even in the 20th century, the rapid growth in food trade. Unfortunately, I can't find data for the 19th century, but the growth in food trade is already beginning by the middle of the 19th century. Before the advent of refrigeration and rapid transportation, steam engines and railroads, the only kind of food items that were traded were things that had a long shelf life. And were very valuable. Things like spices or things that could be processed, like turning sugar into things like rum, molasses. Those were the kind of things that were part of the food trade. With these changes in technology now, the types of food tea was another big one that was an early part of the global food trade. But if you think about changes, that today we're exporting tons of food of all kinds, and weight is relevant. It doesn't have to be lightweight because shipping is so much cheaper and faster than it used to be. That has completely shifted the dynamics of agriculture in the world. Okay, I mentioned that selective breeding doesn't just exist on its own. It is part of a package, and that package includes mechanization, things like tractors, combines. Mechanization allows for very little labor relative to the past, able to produce an enormous amount of food. And the effect that has had is that if you think about the United States, over time, fewer and fewer people are working in agriculture. When we became a country, almost everybody, more than 80% of the population, was involved in agriculture. And if you fast forward to today, numbers vary, but it's generally recognized that in the US today, less than 2% of the population is involved in food production. Then, as I mentioned, we have monoculture and regional specialization, where entire region might be specialized in one or two crops. We have the advent of pesticides, fertilizers, herbicides, and increased water input. And often, at least in the West, government is investing the money to build the infrastructure to provide farmers with incredibly cheap water for them to grow their crops with. So this is a package. It would not, selective breeding would not in its own work by itself. And let's look at why. What you're trying to do with selective breeding is you're trying to get usually more reproductive output out of a plant, unless it's a true vegetable like spinach where you're consuming the leafy matter. Most of what we eat, almost all our calories, comes from the reproductive tissue of plants. Seeds in the case of grains, nuts, even things we call vegetables like tomatoes, cucumbers, those are really fruit. That's the reproductive tissue of the plant. And what selective breeding tries to accomplish is tries to get the plant to take its entire budget, put as much of it as possible into reproduction. On top of that, most of the calories we consume are annuals, which means these are plants that grow and die within a year. And when they, just before they die, they produce their reproductive output, which we harvest. So the goal of selective breeding is to get plants to invest more in their reproduction. And you can only do this at a cost. Think about you as a student. If you have a budget that you get every month and you go out and blow your budget on the first day on some hobby, let's say buying concert tickets, you will have nothing else for the rest of the month unless your parents are very generous. It's not the way it works with plants. If plants are going to put most of their metabolism into reproduction, creates weaknesses in other areas. So what we've developed are usually plants that are dwarfish, that don't invest a lot in shoots. They don't have extensive root systems because that would take a lot of energy and nutrients. Likewise, plants are normally able to defend themselves against pests, diseases, but this also requires valuable nutrients like nitrogen. So what we do in creating these high yield varieties is we're creating very vulnerable plants that basically can't exist without our help. And that help includes keeping out competition through the use of herbicides, protecting them against disease and insects, pests through the use of pesticides, applying heavy fertilizer, because not only do these have poor root structures compared to older varieties, but we're also not rotating fields anymore. So if you think about corn, which is a very nitrogen hungry crop, it would quickly deplete the soil of nitrogen if we weren't constantly enriching the soil with nitrogen. And it's not just nitrogen that we need, we also need lots of phosphorus and potassium. Phosphorus is key, especially to get plants to reproduce. You grow flowers or vegetables or fruit at home, it's important to hit plants with a lot of phosphorus, make sure there's enough of it in the soil, because that's key to getting reproductive output. Flowers come before reproductive output. So selective breeding has created these very dependent plants that would not survive without also water. They require a lot more water. They're not very resilient. These plants are not bred for resiliency, to survive a drought. These plants are created to produce a lot of output, but that output only happens under optimal conditions. And if conditions are suboptimal, they can quickly fail. All right, now I'd like to look at some of the downsides of industrial agriculture. First of all, and I've been hinting at this, is that it's the push for efficiency over resiliency, whether it's in plant breeding or whether it's in narrow specialization. So I mentioned that in this slide, I mentioned that international organizations have pushed countries to specialize narrowly. And during the 1990s and the first decade of this century, they used the fact that many low countries were heavily indebted to groups like the International Monetary Fund and World Bank, twisted arms to make them specialize in things they could export. Now, think of a scenario where you're a country like Sudan and you're growing mostly cotton for export, or Zimbabwe and you're focused mostly on producing canned beef for export. Um, think about what happens. The idea is you're going to export that and you're going to use the money you get from exporting that to buy grains to feed your population. But let's say, as happened in 2007, the price of grains goes way up, but what you have to sell, price stays constant. All of a sudden now, you can't afford to import enough food to feed your population. And this isn't a hypothetical. There was a shortage in grains globally a decade ago that kind of peaked around 2007, 2008. Lots of people were threatened with hunger. In more than 50 countries, we saw food riots. Most people attribute the rapid rise in the price of grains and the pain it caused in the Arab world to the Arab Spring, where people rose up and rebelled. In the case of Syria, it's a little more complicated. You also have a drought involved there, and farmers losing their entire crop, ending up often destitute in cities. You can even see the effects of this emphasis on optimizing, on total efficiency, in the ridiculous consolidation of the US meat supply chain, where a few companies now produce almost all our meat, and a few giant facilities produce large percentages of our beef or pork. With COVID-19 and the infections, I mean, some of the worst infections in the country been seen in meat processing facilities. Um, and we've been keeping them open in part in spite of the impacts on the workers, because not it's not only a question of the consumers not having access to meat, but farmers, if they're not able to get their animals into these few processing plants, have no choice but to euthanize their animals and bury them in the field. And this isn't a hypothetical. This is something that with COVID-19, we've seen huge numbers of farmers killing their animals because they have no choice. There's no way to send them to be processed. So this has been a huge debacle. And this is a product of our thinking where we just try to make things as efficient as possible. And something as important as our food supply chains, we should be thinking about how to make sure those are resilient. Okay, I also, another thing that few people think about is the link between the industrialization of agriculture and the decline of rural areas. If you think about towns around the country now in rural areas that are suffering, they're suffering because they've lost their surrounding population. Where you used to have thousands of farmers around a town, now you may have dozens, especially where you have very large farm sizes like in the Midwest. When you had large numbers of farmers, those farmers would support small towns. They would go into town, buy from local stores, often buy their seeds and their farm equipment from local vendors, shop in, go to movie theaters, go to restaurants and diners when they would come into town. As that farm population shrinks, the ability to sustain these small towns begins to erode away. On top of that, the remaining farmers aren't buying their equipment in town anymore. They're buying it from large companies, and they're usually have this one-shop deal where they can buy almost everything they need from very few places. Um, On top of that, you also have the advent of large stores that sell, like Walmart, that are one-stop shops that often be located in a triangle between a few small towns so that people can drive there, and then those help finish off downtown areas. So two reasons have really led to the decline of rural areas in the country. First is the small number of people working in agriculture. The second is the decline of lower wage industrial jobs. As the United States put very little emphasis on manufacturing, a lot of manufacturing has left the US. This wasn't an inevitability. Many high income countries like Germany were able to migrate up the manufacturing chain to high value manufacturing and maintain a much greater number of jobs. So for comparison, Germany has about 22% of its population still employed in manufacturing, and those are now really good mid-pay jobs. In the US, that's about 9%. And if you live in places like the Western Piedmont, you've driven around lots of deserted factories, and that has had huge impact on our small towns. So decline in the number of people in agriculture and the failure of the US to do more to keep manufacturing by nurturing advanced manufacturing has really crippled a lot of rural areas in the country. Now, another problem with industrial agriculture is its reliance on pesticides. Agriculture today is very reliant on pesticides, more so than in the past, because of these seeds are very needy. They are a lot less likely to survive on their own compared to varieties of seeds people might have planted 80, 100 years ago. Second, we're planting enormous monocultures. So we're creating an incredible banquet for anything that can eat that particular crop. So sometimes people use false comparisons. They'll look at data from the 1930s, they'll compare it with data today, and they'll say, look, we're using all these pesticides, but pests still consume the same amount of crop as they did back in the 1930s. That's a false comparison because of the changes I described, such as monoculture, that have occurred. Now, problem with our reliance on pesticides is that it does a lot of environmental destruction. On top of that, you also quickly see the emergence of pesticide resistance. So, want to have you look at this. Shows the red beetle here doesn't necessarily represent a different color. It just means that it has genetic variation that the beetle's colored white. It's the same species. Just like in any population, you have genetic variety. That genetic variety of the red beetle could be some kind of enzyme pump that allows it to survive when being hit with a pesticide. So what you see is that as you have subsequent sprays, the population is starting to evolve to look like the red colored beetle here, to all have that particular enzyme pump that allows it to survive being sprayed. There still will be some of the white, those that lack that because they were lucky and somehow avoided being sprayed and continue pass their genes on into the next generation. But sooner or later, what you're creating, this is evolution through natural selection. So you're creating a population of beetles that's entirely resistant to the pesticide. Now, on top of that, you have big changes in the environment, and these are really well demonstrated by the classical example of what's called the treadmill. Treadmill is the idea that when farmers begin to spray pesticides, they often have to not only spray more pesticides, but more lethal pesticides over time. It's treadmill is kind of maybe not the best analogy, because this is a treadmill that you not only have to stay on, but you have to move faster and faster. That would be a better analogy. And the reason you have to do that, one is because you've got the pests are becoming resistant, but two, also you're changing the environment and you're unleashing new pests onto the field. And need to identify what those changes are. And I'm going to add a slide that will give you an example of what a parasitoid is. So what we're doing when we randomly spray non-target poisons on a field is we're not only killing the target organism, but we're killing just about everything there, not just invertebrates, but even eventually a lot of vertebrates that will bioaccumulate that pesticide and either die, or like in the case of birds, their eggs will be too thin and they won't hatch. If you think about what controls other insects, sometimes predators play an important role, such as birds, spiders, praying mantises. But one of the main controls on insects are other insects. And by that I mean parasitoids. Parasitoid, what's different between a parasite and a parasitoid is a parasite won't kill you. It may make you weak and susceptible to a disease that will kill you, but a parasitoid will kill you. Fortunately, except in science fiction like Aliens, humans don't have any parasitoids. Insects have parasitoids. And what's interesting about insects is that the world is full of an incredible variation of insects. The great bulk of biodiversity on land are insects. H.P. Halliday, a 19th century biologist, was once, or early 20th century, giving a lecture to a group of religious leaders in England, and somebody asked him what his studies of nature had taught him about the Creator. And he said, after pausing for a minute, that the Creator must have an inordinate fondness for beetles. Now, why are there so many insects and things like beetles out there? It's because of coevolution. On the one side, plants are developing ways to defend themselves, chemical compounds that can poison insects. Insects are locking in and developing ways to get around those poisons. So their evolutionary path is becoming closely attached to a plant or a few closely related types of plants. Same thing is true with parasitoids. The insects that are eating those plants have immune systems, and those immune systems are evolving to find ways to destroy the eggs that parasitoids are putting on or in the insect, ways to encapsulate the egg and destroy it. And parasitoids are thus forced into a narrow coevolutionary relationship where parasitoid is often also only able to put an egg on certain species or closely related species. Usually it's only a single species that can provide it with a host. And they've evolved really incredible ways to find their host, even being able to smell their feces and know exactly where their host is. So if you think about what's controlling insect populations, parasitoids are doing a good job in nature of keeping populations low. When you start to go into an area and just spray it, you start to unleash secondary pests. And cotton is a great example of that. In 1955 in Nicaragua, you have the advent of industrial scale cotton production. And DDT is being used 1955 to control one insect, the boll weevil. In 10 years, you needed more pesticides, strong new pesticides, not just to control the boll weevil, it's becoming resistant to the original DDT, but now you have 9 pests of cotton that without control would decimate your cotton farms. By 1975, there were so many pests, people stopped even identifying which were the important pests, and farmers had to spray about every 2 days. One study did identify over 50, around 54 pests of cotton. By 1985, industrial scale cotton production was abandoned in Nicaragua. It was basically impossible. So this is a good example of what can happen with the pesticide treadmill. Certainly areas that are subtropical, tropical are even more vulnerable than temperate areas. Another important negative is loss of biodiversity. Agriculture is one of the major reasons we've been losing biodiversity. Habitat loss, a huge amount of land on the planet is now used for either agriculture or as urban habitat for humans. Agriculture is responsible for a lot of invasive species. Many of you high school saw the famous cane toad video where different things are introduced, the idea of controlling pests, but actually create a much worse problem. In our search for especially seafood, we're overexploiting the oceans. So food production is a major driver of biodiversity loss. But industrial agriculture or selective breeding is also a big factor that's responsible for genetic loss in key crops. So you can see this is doesn't highlight any of our most important crops like corn or wheat, but the same thing is true where we've decimated number of varieties available of key, and I call them key crops because this is what gives us our calories. This is what we live on. These other things, of course, are very important. They allow us to lead healthy lives, but we need a certain amount of calories to power our existence. And selective breeding really is contemptuous, has been contemptuous of genetic diversity. Now, according to the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization, over the last century, we've lost 75% of our crop genetic diversity. And this has simply been because agricultural food system values uniformity. It values certain things like high yield. It doesn't value characteristics that give resiliency, like ability to protect against insects or drought tolerance. And these are things that are becoming more and more important as we move forward. And having that entire genome is very important to kind of next generation technologies like gene editing. Without good percentage of the genome, those technologies are very limited. One agronomist, Jack Harlan, has actually said that the biodiversity within crop species, that means the genetic diversity, is what stands between us and catastrophic starvation on a scale we cannot imagine. That's because within that diversity is often resistance to diseases that could wipe out very important crop like wheat or rice. But you might say, what about GMOs? GMOs might also allow resistance, but GMOs are tricky because they often wreak havoc on the metabolism of the plant. The best way to create resiliency is to work within the genome of a given plant. And again, in the last 100 years, we've lost a lot of the genome that used to be there just by neglecting a lot of our traditional varieties. So as an example, if you were to go back 100 years ago and look at a field of wheat in Greece or Turkey, there might be dozens of varieties. Farmers would plant them intentionally. Some of those varieties didn't produce a lot, but they were very drought tolerant. So if there was a drought, farmer wouldn't face an empty harvest. But with modern agriculture, those low yielding varieties have been looked at with contempt, have been ignored, and a lot of them have disappeared. Another problem with industrial agriculture are dietary changes and our growing public health crisis. The path on the left towards burgers, fries, and pizza, we're able to produce a lot of these commodity products incredibly cheap. Um, Top of that, we subsidize it to make it even cheaper. So it entire generation or two now, like especially in the US, have grown up on this kind of food and thinks that this is a proper way to eat. And that's responsible for our health crisis. There have been some studies that estimate Americans leave about 8 good years of life on the table. Doesn't mean necessarily that we die 8 years prematurely, but basically our last 8 years of life, we are um, dependent on enormous numbers of drugs. We're really expensive to keep alive, and our quality of life is pretty crappy. That's because we're picking the pathway on the left towards junk food rather than the path on the right towards healthy food. Government has played a large role in this too. You can see the subsidies going towards different crops in the US. The local vegetable farmer isn't getting a lot of government subsidies. Corn and then wheat and soybeans have collected the bulk of those subsidies. And basically, if you think about fast food, corn and soybeans are going to feed the animals. Corn's going into the sugary beverages. Wheat is going into making the buns. Um, and what this is doing is it makes really bad food artificially cheap. I mean, even if you think about cheese, I mean, with soybeans and corn incredibly cheap, it's easy to keep lots of dairy cows and feed them very cheaply. So we're awash in cheap milk and cheap cheese. So that, again, makes that pizza very cheap. And you can see cheap process. In addition, a lot of these commodity crops like corn make it cheap to produce processed food. And let me distinguish between processed food and ultra processed food. Processed food is anything that's been changed, like kombucha is a processed food, cheese is a processed food. And ultra processed food, you know it when you see it, when you need a background in chemistry to read the label on the food. That is an ultra processed food. And I recommend that you look at the literature on ultra processed foods. There's a growing body of literature that's showing its relationship to disease and shorter lifespans, and also really bad endings such as Alzheimer's, dementia. So this is part of the cost of the food supply chain we have developed in the United States. On top of that, there's a lot of power to keep that here. A lot of big farmers are very wealthy and very influential. Again, you can see where government generosity is going. It's going into large super farms. The small farmer who sells at your farmer's market is not the beneficiary of government policy. It's the people growing these large commodity crops like soybeans, corn, um, wheat, rice that are getting most of the government money, or have been. We're also exporting, we've exported this problem. All around the world now, people copying this kind of diet. The tragedy often of people lifting their incomes from low level to the next level, when you go from being very poor and not being able to buy things like a Coca-Cola to becoming lower middle income in most of the world, is that you start to buy lots of things like soda and drink lots of soda, buy fast food like hamburgers. And what we're seeing around the world is an obesity crisis that is not as great yet as the US, but is many parts of the world is tracking the trajectory that we saw in the US. I'm going to talk about some of the environmental problems in the next lecture. When we talk about limitations of our current agricultural systems and why we need new technologies, a lot of these limitations have to do with what we're doing to the environment. at some point, agriculture can't continue the way it is with its disrespect of soils, with its prolific use of water. There's just not that much water, fresh water available. Using water that's artificially subsidized, kind of techniques that we use to water our crops is still backward in terms of the technology. So we'll take this up in the next lecture, because the way we're degrading the environment gets back to the idea of neo-Malthusians, that we're going to lower our carrying capacity. We have to begin in our food production systems to begin to reconsider, we need to reconsider the damage we're doing to the environment. And the great challenge is that as population continues to grow, we have to feed more people without expanding the amount of land, because if we do that, we'll wipe out biodiversity. And we have to do that by constantly pushing the environmental impact down. That's an enormous challenge, but challenges are good for entrepreneurs. So keep in mind that a space that's seeing a lot of new technologies and a lot of entrepreneurship is in the food space. You're going to be watching a video on Norman Borlaug, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time now. I just want to introduce Norman Borlaug as the father of the Green Revolution. The first day of the semester, I introduced Paul Ehrlich, the evolutionary biologist from Stanford University, who is known as the father of neo-Malthusians. In some ways, Paul Ehrlich was more of a Malthusian. His book that he wrote in 1968 called The Population Bomb predicted horrific starvation in the world by the 1980s. What Ehrlich didn't realize was the work that Norman Borlaug and his group of scientists was doing down in Mexico with the sponsorship of the Rockefeller Foundation. What Borlaug was able to do basically was harness capital-intensive agriculture as was practiced in the United States and adopt it to warmer tropical conditions. Develop new varieties of things like wheat and rice that could grow in the tropics. And as a result of Borlaug's work, lots of people, hundreds of millions of people probably, especially in Asia, especially in South Asia, were kept from starvation. Paul Ehrlich predicted that places like India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan were going to see starvation on an unprecedented scale. Not only did that not happen, but by the 1980s, India was actually a big grain exporter, and that lasted for a while. It's starting to run its course. But so when you think about the impacts of the Green Revolution, consider that starvation is a horrific outcome. In a way, Borlaug bought us time. Today, it's very common to vilify Borlaug because of all the impacts, negative impacts of the Green Revolution. But we'll talk about this more after you see the Borlaug video. I don't think it's proper to vilify him. I think we should think about him instead of someone who bought us time, even though that came at a great cost. But the great cost is still less than massive starvation. So a little bit about the Green Revolution. So the Green Revolution applied pretty much the same package selective breeding applied in the US. Now, first of all, a problem is that in low-income countries, you had lots of subsistence farmers, people who were very small, mostly almost doing extensive farming. No capital inputs, not a lot of innovation in terms of labor-intensive farming. They're basically producing what they need to eat. Not a lot more is left over to sell. So these new technologies are a little bit out of place in that kind of environment. Actually, a little aside, in the US, when we applied this technology package back in the 30s and 40s, already in the 30s in the Depression, a lot of farmers had lost their land. found their ways into cities where they found jobs in manufacturing, especially during the war. After the war, this continues and accelerates because as you grow more food, you push prices down. And low prices are really hit small farmers hard because if they're dependent on the revenue of what they're growing and selling, their output is not going to grow enough to be able to make up for lower prices. So um, he, Borlaug and company produced these miracle seeds that were used to feed animals, but required the entire package as in the United States. It also required government and international organizations like the World Bank to invest a lot in expensive schemes like irrigation and fertilizers. Again, small farmers couldn't afford this, or if they tried to afford this, they probably entered into a debt cycle, which led them to bankruptcy and losing their land. So if you buy a bunch of things with the promise that you'll pay off your loan with your harvest, but then prices go down, you don't get enough money, and you go through a cycle or two like this, you will soon not be able to pay off your debt and you will lose your land and end up landless. So poor farmers couldn't compete. Large farms got bigger. This is what happens with this technology. You have to get bigger or get out or find some new innovative niche doing value-added farming. Loss of subsistence farming. So if you are a subsistence farmer and you lose your land, what can you do? You either become a landless laborer working on other people's farms, and that's a terrible existence, or you take your chance and you move into cities. Now, the difference between what happened in the United States in the 30s and 40s is that our industry was growing rapidly. There were lots of jobs being created in and around our cities. And so people, of course, suffered when they had to make that move and when they lost their farm. But within a reasonable amount of time, they were able to get back on their feet and provide for their families. In the world today, that's not true. We're not creating that many jobs in the formal sector. So many people who make the move from rural to urban areas are winding up having to create their own jobs, often the informal sector, doing things like finding recyclables and trash, standing at traffic lights, trying to make money, forcing you to pay for them washing your windshield. It's a very rough existence for many people who live in urban slums today to try and get the food they need to eat on a day-to-day basis. So same damage to rural economies that we saw in the United States, also to the environment and the ecosystem. Increasing dominance of large agrochemical companies like Cargill, Bayer. These become incredibly powerful over people's lives. Syngenta, AgroChina. There are not a small handful of companies today that control agrochemicals and seeds. Here, thank you for listening to today's lecture. Here are the questions we will be discussing in our next class. Thank you.